presentation lives up to it. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Atelier, and everyone involved. Thank you, Margaret. And thank you all for coming. I really appreciate you being here. I'm in month 5 of a 6-month tour around the world right now, teaching everywhere from New Zealand to New York to York. Actually, the next stop will be York, England, in less than a week. I'm really excited. I like to give lectures a lot. I like to talk about sculpture. And in the United States, I've given this lecture a few times this season. I'm really happy to do this one for you guys too, because it's something that is relevant. I wanted to present something that really resonates with artists and the art-loving public in the United States. It's so easy to view art history as something just a little bit abstracted, theoretical maybe, or something that took place in the past. And of course, it's our history. It did take place in the past. But art history is continuing. We are the current chapter of art history. And so I'm really happy to be talking about American sculptors and the past and current connection to Italy, which is what this little lecture is all about. So there's a really special connection between the United States and Florence and Rome in the 19th century. From 1825 to 1875, more or less, if you were an aspiring painter or sculptor, you came to Florence or you came to Rome to study under European masters. And then you either came back, you were repatriated to the United States and tried to have a career in the United States and offer your work to the poor, ignorant, benighted fools of the 19th century in the United States who knew nothing about art and scandalized at the thought of a nude statue. Or, just as often, you would stay in Italy and open up a studio that served as one of the stopping points on the Grand Tour. The Grand Tour is a centuries-old tradition, and it still kind of survives to some extent today, whereby the moneyed youths of America and indeed Europe would travel around, sort of like a gap year. It would take several months to several years and sort of travel Europe, see all the big sites, to get culture, and then to go back home and with bragging rights about all the places you've been and the people you've met, that sort of thing. It usually involved several letters of introduction that you get from your dad and his work associates or whatever that would get you into different places around Europe. And quite often, these people on the Grand Tour would want to bring back a souvenir. And in the days before plastic, that meant art. That meant paintings or sculptures. And so you could earn quite a tidy living just by having a sculpture studio in Florence and being an American. And every American who comes through Florence is going to track you down so that they can actually have conversations in English and see your work and then maybe commission a portrait bust from you, which you would then execute and ship back to them at their home address in the United States. And so it's kind of an interesting little economy, an art economy at that time. And it wasn't just the United States as well. If you were a Danish sculptor living in Rome, then all the Danish people would come through Rome, would stop at your studio. So you really sort of cater to your own nationalities quite a bit. And Florence and Rome were absolutely full of Americans. Notably, Rome was filled with female sculptors. We don't hear too much about 19th century female sculptors, unless we've read our Henry James, in which he describes the female cadre of sculptors as the white Marmorian flock. Marmorian means marble-like, because they were always covered with marble dust. But it included the likes of Harriet Hosmer, Edmonia Lewis, and many others. Many other very, very notable sculptors, although maybe not household names today. But apart from women, of course, we've got people like Horatio Ratio, who we'll be talking about, Thomas Ball, Hiram Powers, another sculptor I'm going to be talking about, William Wentworth Story. And then, of course, later on, you get people like Daniel Chester French, who is probably known to some of you as the sculptor of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., and also the Farragut Memorial in New York City, and many others. But today we're going to focus on two gentlemen, Hiram Powers and Horatio Ratio. They were both born in the same year, 1805, born into very, very different circumstances, and their careers were just as different from each other as their origin stories. Really, really interesting people. They were basically the first generation. Horatio Ratio was the first American to leave American shores to go to Europe to study sculpture. But they weren't the first European-influenced American sculptors. That has to go to the title of America's first European-influenced American sculptor who never went to Europe, would have to be William Rush. Now, William Rush was the son of a ship's carpenter, who then later apprenticed to a woodcarver. And it's very clear that at some point Rush started to look to Europe for guidance in his carving. In the 1790s, he became a very celebrated woodcarver. In fact, he made all the ship's maidens, the maidenheads for all the tall ships of the newly born United States Navy, frigates and gunships and all sorts of things. None of these, sadly, maidenheads survived. And it's thought that how he received most of the influence for these works were actually from the visiting European tall ships. These maidenheads would come in, and there's sort of oblique references that you find that maybe he made copies in clay of these maidenheads as they come in, and that sort of infused his style somewhat with a European taste. But he did more than figureheads. You see here, these are two statues, two allegorical figures carved in wood that he made for a temporary triumphal arch for the visit of the Marquis de Lafayette to the United States in 1824. And in fact, that interesting looking bust in the center is of the Marquis de Lafayette. There are several other portrait busts that he did, done not just in wood, but a few in plaster and a few in terracotta, which shows that he had quite a good understanding, at least as to the technical processes of how to make a sculpture, right? But really a very, very limited career, just because of where he was and the time he was in. But his real contribution to American art was in his interest in promoting European-style art on American shores. And a lot of what Rush knew about European art that didn't come from these maidenheads came from his friend, the American painter who trained in England, Charles Wilson Peale. And together, in 1805, William Rush and Peale opened up a small art academy and museum in Philadelphia, and it was called the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art. And it still exists today. It's the oldest and first art academy in the United States. Now, just as an aside, I was very proud to actually deliver this lecture at the Pennsylvania Academy this spring. Now the institution obviously is still going strong today, and it was instrumental in getting the early Americans acquainted with the ideas of European art. Now obviously the Grand Tour actually predates the United States. The English were traveling the continent on the Grand Tour, back as late as the late 17th century, really. And so there were a few of the wealthy elite in the United States who went on the Grand Tour, but for everyone else, art in the European style, practically art generally, was just kind of unknown. But it was the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art that really started to introduce, at least New England, to these ideas, these forms, these genres, and these mediums. They would hold annual exhibitions, and they actually started to collect the work of American artists, including the likes of Gilbert Stuart and Thomas Eakins, and you can see those works still in their collection on the walls of the Pennsylvania Academy today. Now, a few years after the founding of PAFA, as the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts is called, another institution opened. It was a library called the Boston Athenaeum, which of course is still going strong today as well. Eventually, soon after its founding, it included an art gallery as well, collecting minor works of art, paintings, a few sculptures. And it was really the center of the fostering of American culture in New England at that time. In 1823, though, things really changed for the fate of the Americans' exposure to sculpture. In 1823, the Boston Athenaeum received by post a collection of 9 plaster casts, hand-picked by Antonio Canova, the great neoclassical sculptor himself, living in Rome. He picked them, he died very, very shortly after that, actually. Sent them to the Boston Athenaeum. They were obviously ordered by the Boston Athenaeum. There were 9 plaster casts copied from great masterworks of antiquity. So the Torso Belvedere, the Leacre, what else did they have? The Apollo Belvedere, or the Apollo Belvedere, as we call it, and many others. And this was the first time that American audiences could experience the exposure of three-dimensional sculpture, full scale, in the flesh, so to speak. Not quite in marble, but just almost as good, almost as good. And there were wealthy individuals here and there that would bring back, small busts, and they would donate these to the Boston Athenaeum over time as well. But it really was this non-plaster cast that became a core curriculum, as it were, for any young aspiring art student in the United States. So it was not a lot. It was about all America had to afford up into the 1820s. So it was a slow start. And so it's no wonder that it wasn't until about 1825 that we finally get the very first American to leave America to go to Europe with the express intent of becoming an artist. And that was Horatio Ratio. He was the son of a prosperous merchant in Boston, born in 1805, the same year that the Pennsylvania Academy was founded. And Horatio's interest in sculpture was kindled at a pretty young age. His father himself had gone to Europe on the grand tour, brought back an antique marble, not an antique marble, but a marble copy of an antique work, a bust of an Athenian general, which sat in the back garden, and it fascinated Horatio Ratio. As a young boy, he would carve copies of it in soap. He even tried a little bit of limestone carving, a little bit of clay. He actually taught himself, this is so adorable, he taught himself how to model in clay by reading the encyclopedia entry on clay in the encyclopedia. That was the extent of his instruction as a younger man. But his father was also a lover of the classics, and he had quite an extensive library in which Horatio grew up. And by the time Horatio was 12 years old, he was not just copying the little Athenian general in the back garden, he was making busts of different characters from antiquity or the Bible. People like William Penn, the founder of Pennsylvania, and he had, picked up several different barely suitable tools and materials in which to make these things. He would carve things in chunks of chalk. But when he was 16 years old, he entered Harvard University, and there he studied the classics and languages and mathematics, but he also kept up his interest in sculpture, learning anatomy from a local doctor, doing what he could to piece together a bit of an education, as best as he could. But the most significant event, of course, came in 1823 when he was a third-year student at Harvard, and that was the arrival of the gift of those 9 plaster casts from Rome. And it absolutely changed the course of Horatio Ratio's life. He knew exactly what he wanted to do with his life after the exposure to those casts. And I think this cast collection at the Boston Athenaeum, as well as the burgeoning cast collection and art collection at Peale, goes a long way in explaining exactly why, because this is a common question that occurs to people, why Americans started going to Italy rather than Paris. Right? You think of Paris as being the center of art in the 19th century. Well, it was and it wasn't. It wasn't really at the beginning of the 19th century where all the major sculptors certainly were. They were in places like Florence and in Rome. You have Lorenzo Bartolini in Florence. You have Antonio Canova in Rome. You have Bertoldo Valls in Rome. This is at the height of neoclassicism in sculpture. And so it was to Rome where not only you found the best sculptors, but it's also where you found the source code for neoclassicism, which is, of course, the classics, antiquity. Rome is kind of full of it. Right? You can get that there also in Paris, but it wasn't until sort of the middle of the century, certainly after the reforms of the Beaux-Arts in the 1860s, that you really get Americans starting to turn to Paris rather than to Italy to become artists. Yeah. So immediately after finishing Harvard in 1825, Horatio Ratio prepared to sail to Rome. And he did. Sailed for Italy, stopped briefly in Genoa, and then in Florence before arriving in Rome in the autumn of 1825. And he arrived with a letter of introduction to Bertoldo Valls himself. At that time, the greatest neoclassical sculptor in Rome, probably on the continent. Canova had died just a few years earlier, so that was not an option to study under Canova. But Horatio Ratio didn't study under Bertoldo Valls either. He chose instead to get a large apartment with a painter, a fellow American who was studying in Rome, Robert Weir, if you're interested. And they sort of made a little joint private studio, and they taught themselves. So in the mornings, Horatio would draw from the antique plaster cast, but also original antiques, usually located in various art galleries around Rome, but also including the Villa Medici, which is this fantastic building we see here. The Villa Medici is it became the Académie de France in Rome, which is where all the prix de Rome winners from the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris would then sojourn and spend 5 years studying the classics. And it was open rather informally to other artists to come in and study for their collection as well. So quite often Horatio Ratio would spend his mornings drawing from the antique at the Villa Medici. It's really interesting. He wasn't there very long. He was there in Rome for about a year and a half before he came back to the United States. He actually caught malaria. He contracted malaria and came back to the United States to recuperate. But in that year and a half of self-study, he imagined himself to have gained quite an education, as is abundantly evident in the letters he would write back home to friends and family. He would just sort of denigrate just every other artist and sculptor, both contemporary and historically, and as if he knew it all. He would just pass judgments on the aesthetics of all the Italian sculptors. They were just narrow-minded and just focused on technique, and even Canova was clever, but maybe a little superficial. So Horatio Ratio really knew himself after that, knew his stuff after that year and a half of study. But maybe it's perhaps what we might expect from a young first-year student. Suddenly in this rarefied culture, he could go back to the United States as being one of the more educated members of the populace, certainly in the arts, and that's exactly what happened when he went back home and recovered from malaria. So, although he was really the only American sculptor on American shores to be trained in Europe, you would think that would set him up quite nicely. It did, in fact, but the patrons of art were just as scarce. Market, supply and demand. There was one guy supplying, and just a few people demanded. But those few people were at the highest levels of society. You've got, the President of the United States, John Quincy Adams, was the President of Harvard University, Samuel Appleton, which is this gentleman right here, is John Quincy Adams. He did John Jacob Astor, and so on. So there was a demand, not too much of a demand, but there was some demand for his work. And the portraits, they're not too bad, considering the limited education that Horatio had received at the time. They're pretty much in line with the usual portraits that might be churned out of the studios on the grand tour. nothing that would really distinguish Horatio's work there in these early busts. Now, in the process of creating these busts, Horatio had to do a bit of traveling. It's not like you just open the studio and people would come from all over New England to study under him, or to sit for him. He'd have to go here and there, and then he'd go to Washington, he'd go to New York, and he would meet many leading lights of society and culture. People like, who did he meet? Longfellow, and all those guys. What do they call them? The transcendentalists. That's right. Yeah, he hung out with yeah. But it's interesting. He became lifelong friends and correspondents. He's an avid letter writer, which serves us in history well, because just after a year of being back in the United States, Horatio goes back to Italy. And the reason he does this is quite simple. Horatio, in making these busts, would make them in clay. He would model them in clay from life. The sitter would be there, and he'd make the clay. But the commissions were for marble busts. He didn't carve marble. He didn't know, he didn't learn how to carve marble. And so, and that wasn't a particularly shameful thing. In fact, it was quite standard for someone to be a sculptor who would really just produce the clay models. Then you make a mold and cast that clay into plaster. You have plaster cast, or maybe you just have assistants do that. And then you have yet other assistants carve that work into marble. You have the plaster cast, and you can use very simple devices and tools to make a very, very accurate copy into marble. And so this was generally done by assistants. The town of Pietrasanta and Carrara in Italy, these towns are full, even today, of shops that do nothing but produce the sculpture in marble of other sculptors around the world. So, they'll model this big in clay, and they'll ship you in a couple of years' time. It's only 12 feet tall and gleaming polished marble without the original artist ever having touched it. Seems like cheating, doesn't it? It's not. It's how it's always been. If you're gonna carve everything yourself, it's gonna take a while. So if you have any sort of success in your career, you're gonna very quickly find ways to save on all the drudgery, because pointing in marble really is a technical process rather than an artistic, creative process, up until about the last 2%, right? So all the creation happens in clay. So it's a bit more legit than it sounds. So he goes back to Italy. Horatio Greener goes back to Italy, and instead of going to Rome, he stops off first at Carrara and Pietrasanta, the towns I just mentioned where marble carvers live and produce the work of others. So he's dropping off his busts and finding suitable marble and suitable carvers to do his work. And while he's there, he sees the work of an Italian sculptor who lives in Florence by the name of Lorenzo Bartolini. Now, Bartolini was the big man in Florence at the time. He really was only second to Canova in his lifetime in terms of his popularity as a neoclassical sculptor. And Horatio Greener saw his work and fell in love with it, and went to Florence instead of Rome, knocked on Horatio Greener's door and begged, knocked on Bartolini's door and begged Bartolini to take him in as a student. Not only did Bartolini take him in, but he gave him a small room in the studio itself in which Horatio Greener could live. And he did so happily for over a year. Now in Bartolini's studio, Horatio was a quick study, and he was soon producing very respectable portrait busts, essentially identical to the quality of anyone else in Florence, with the exception of the big man here, Lorenzo Bartolini. He actually had quite a bit of talent, and when he finally got a really systematic training, that training allowed his talent really to blossom. And so it was in Florence that Horatio Greener settled, and he was, he opened up his own studio. He was one of the regulars on, regular stop on the Grand Tour, as I mentioned, meeting people coming from the United States, people like Emerson, Longfellow, and many more. Just fantastic list of who's who when you read through his collected letters. It's a really fascinating thing. So we've gotten halfway through Horatio Greener's career. We see where he's come from and how he got to be a sculptor. We'll come back to him a little bit, but I want to sort of compare and contrast the life and early career of another man, Hiram Powers. Fantastic looking guy. He always wore that hat, apparently. Every picture I've ever seen of him, photograph or drawing, has that unusual hat. He liked it. Now, Hiram Powers had a very, very different upbringing than Horatio Ratio. Even though they were born the same year, very, very different circumstances. Hiram Powers was the son of a poor farmer in Vermont who moved his large family to Cincinnati, Ohio, where Hiram Powers' mother and father both promptly died, leaving Hiram Powers in work at the age of 15 or 16. So he had to drop out of school and he went to work, and he worked for 6 years as a clockmaker's apprentice. After working for 6 years, he took a different job, which offered him a little bit of creativity. Apparently, he had that sort of impulse in him, and he took a job that he found much more interesting. He went to work as a sort of general handyman at the establishment in Cincinnati known as the Dorfay's Western Museum in Cincinnati. Now, Dorfay's Western Museum, we don't have things like this anymore. It's kind of like a cabinet of curiosities meets sort of, what is that place, like Ripley's Believe It or Not, or Madame Tussauds. It's just filled with all sorts of curiosities and specimens, the kind of place that maybe P.T. Barnum would sort of draw inspiration from to have these sideshows and all sorts of things. And so there were wax dummies and different exotic people from all over the world, little wax, oh, here's a pygmy from Borneo, or here's someone from China, or all sorts of different things. And then geological specimens and maybe two-headed snakes. You get the idea. Just sort of a kind of a tourist trap made somewhat respectable. So Hiram Powers was working at this place, and he was hired specifically because the owner, this guy, Mr. Dorfay, bought secondhand a huge collection of life-size wax dummies, and he wanted Hiram Powers not only to restore them, which would be modeling wax, fixing them noses or whatever was wrong with these dummies, but he was also hired because of his experience as a clockmaker. Mr. Dorfay wanted Hiram Powers to animate these wax figures. These are not those wax figures, by the way. They don't exist. I just had to show a picture of something, so these are some 19th century wax figures, so don't get your hopes up. So by the time Hiram Powers was starting to work on these wax dummies, outfitting them with sort of clockworks, Horatio Ratio was in Washington, D.C. doing portraits of the president. Right? And remember, they were the same age. And he was about to sail again to Florence to study under Lorenzo Bartolini. So they were worlds apart in many ways. But it's right about this time that Hiram Powers, one of those amazing twists of fate, one of those moments that just puts your life on a different course. Hiram Powers met someone, a customer at Dorfay's Western Museum in Cincinnati, walked in the door, and they struck up a friendship. It was an unlikely friendship. Hiram Powers is 22 years old, and the person he met was a divorced single mother, middle-aged, got 6 kids, and an immigrant from England. And her name was Frances Trollope. Now, you might know Frances Trollope by the name Fanny Tall. Years after Hiram Powers would meet Fanny Tall, she would be one of the 19th century's most prolific writers and famous throughout Europe and the United States for her candid and penetrating travel memoirs. She was kind of like a Bill Bryson, if you're familiar with Bill Bryson's work. She actually became very famous. One of her early works was the very first abolitionist novel called Scenes on the Mississippi, and this book would actually directly inspire Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. But the book that really first made Fanny Tall a household name in the United States was a book that was published in 1832, just a few years after she met Hiram Powers. And the book was called Domestic Manners of the Americans. And it was a very blunt critique of American culture at the time that was highly read in Europe and highly criticized in the United States. And she was at the center of the literary and cultural life throughout the 1830s, 1840s, all the way to her death. But in the 1820s, when she met Hiram Powers, she was just another struggling immigrant trying to make ends meet, trying to become a writer. And when Fanny Tall and Hiram Powers met, the two hit it off and they become lifelong friends. And it was Fanny who suggested to Hiram a possible theme for these wax dummies that he was restoring, right? So Hiram Powers had to make a diorama, some sort of scene. He didn't know, he was not educated, he wasn't literate, he didn't, couldn't do a story out of maybe out of the Bible or something like that, or Greek mythology, he wouldn't know the first thing about it. But it was Fanny Tall who suggested, well, these sort of hideous-looking waxworks, these would be perfect to represent a scene from Dante's Inferno, right? She thought it would be an excellent scene to portray with these waxworks. Again, this is not a picture. This is just a little picture. I believe I scoured the internet. There's got to be some sort of, but no, this is the best I can do. So Fanny Tall described, orally, told Hiram Powers several sort of key stories out of Dante's Inferno, and that put Hiram Powers on the road to creating some sort of hellscape populated with the damned and demons and all this sort of thing. It doesn't survive, sadly, but by all accounts, it was an absolute smash hit at Dorfey's Western Museum. It was so popular that the crowds that came to it would actually sort of get too close and knock over a couple of dummies and then have to be reset up. So Hiram Powers, to take care of that problem, he put up a fence, and then he decided to electrify it. Right? And so these people would crush up and get shot, they'd scream, and that actually added to the experience. People thought that was actually part of the thing, so they would intentionally crack on it to get the feeling of being tortured in hell as they gaze upon Dante's Inferno. Pretty ridiculous. It's brilliant though. But can you imagine what sort of safety equipment in terms of electricity you would have in 1832? I'm surprised no one died. Maybe they did. I don't know. Right. But
they just put them in display.
they just added it to the scene, right? It's a good one. I'll have to use that next time. So that was a lot of fun, but of course this is not the usual route to becoming a neoclassical sculptor for anyone, so it didn't just stop there. Fortunately, Hiram Powers was able to come in contact with a real bona fide sculptor, a man by the name of Frederick Eckstein, whose father was the court sculptor to the King of Prussia, back when Prussia was a thing, and they had emigrated to the United States and actually had been involved with the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art for a short time. And then Frederick Eckstein actually moved to Cincinnati and opened up the Cincinnati School of Fine Art, which doesn't exist anymore. In fact, it only ran for about 5 years, but for that entire time, Hiram Powers he might have been the only student, I don't know, I can't find anyone else who attended the school. But Hiram Powers studied under Eckstein for 5 years, learned casting, mold making, modeling in the European tradition. Just like Horatio Ratio decided to do, Hiram Powers realized that if he really wanted to, push himself, he needed to go to Europe. But before he did that, he was put in touch, sort of friend of a friend. He had a lot of local patrons in Cincinnati, and someone said, well, what you really need to do, you need to go to Washington, D.C., because there was this guy who was just there, Horatio Ratio, and he got a bunch of portrait commissions, and he's gone now. So maybe you can, sort of pick up where he left off, and that's exactly what happened. Hiram Powers went to Washington, D.C., sculpted a couple, portraits of, different luminaries, and then, just like Horatio Ratio before him, got on a boat to Italy to have those works carved in marble. And that happened in 1834. So with Horatio Ratio in Florence, Hiram Powers was, again, one of the few, if not the only sculptor active in Washington, D.C. He did Daniel Webster, he did Senator Calhoun, I did Senator Preston, whoever Senator Preston was, I don't know. Andrew Jackson as well. And these are the works of Hiram Powers. These two, Calvin and Jackson. And in the center, we have actually a sculpture by Hiram Powers of Horatio Ratio. Because after Hiram Powers sailed to Italy and got his busts sort of sorted in Carrara and Pietrasanta, he also went to make his home in Florence, where he met and befriended Horatio Ratio. And I think we can see that out of the two. I think Hiram Powers was maybe sort of a little bit more handy, a little bit more delicate and subtle, and maybe just a better sculptor. And so like Horatio Ratio before him, Hiram Powers settled in Florence and was one of the stops on the grand tour. So let's go back to Horatio Ratio. As I mentioned, being a sculptor on one of the stops of the grand tour, put sculptors into touch with all sorts of different people. And for Horatio, one such person was James Fenimore Cooper. And he wrote Leather Stocking Tales, The Last Mohicans. And it was Cooper who became a big fan of Horatio Ratio and helped him land a very prestigious commission in Paris, a bust of the Marquis de Lafayette, seen here. But it was the painter Washington Allston who worked on Horatio's behalf back in the United States to secure for him the greatest commission of Horatio Ratio's career. The national government, federal government in Washington, had decided that the time had come to commission a colossal marble statue of George Washington to go into the Capitol Rotunda. I mean, this was going to be a big commission, right? It would not just be the flagship sculpture of the New World, but really an icon of the nation itself. That was the original intention. And the commission, thanks to Washington Allston's efforts, landed in the lap of Horatio Ratio in 1832, the same year Hiram Powers showed up in Florence. There it is. You might be familiar with this. We know this, if you've been to the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C., you might have bumped into this. Now, Horatio predicted the statue would take 4 years to complete, but in reality, it took more than twice that long. The statue itself, of course, is of George Washington, seated with one arm raised, pointing to the sky, while the other hand holds out a sword. Hilt first, referencing George Washington's voluntary relinquishment of absolute power in the United States. When he could have easily been crowned king rather than be made president. Now, it's a big statue. Even though he's seated, this is still 11 feet tall. And it's a big, big statue, close to twice life size. So the commission had a couple of stipulations in it, but very, very few. They basically trusted Horatio Ratio to do whatever they wanted, as long as he would use the life mask, the plaster cast, made from George Washington's actual face when he was alive by the French sculptor Jean-Antoine Houdon 50 years before. And that was pretty much it. They said, yeah, just do whatever you want. And so of course, like a good little student of neoclassicism, he has to have an antique precedent. This form, this pose of the seated, bare-chested, sort of god with his finger pointing up to the sky is a very, very close copy of the pose of a statue of Zeus, of Phidias, now lost, but known to history through countless reproductions. It was on a lot of coinage, that sort of thing, so people knew what the statue looked like. And so, that sort of oblique references of George Washington being sort of, the king of the gods of the United States, I guess. And then he did it in a neoclassical style. And this is one of the problems with Horatio Ratio's education. He knew what neoclassical sculpture should look like, but he didn't really understand too much how it worked. The statue was not a success. It was seen as something pretty laughable. I think maybe a few of us in the room might share the same sentiment, this idea of George Washington with this huge chest. He's really, ridiculously buff, and presented as a Greek god. It just seems so over the top. And if it seems over the top to us now, just imagine what it was like back in the 1840s to people who actually knew George Washington, right? People were still alive who knew this guy. One of the problems of neoclassicism and idealization is that you really have to be careful with it if you're talking about historical personages. You really need the distance of time. So this is a less ridiculous work today than it was 100 years ago. And as time goes on, and George Washington becomes even more mythical and legendary in our contemporary minds, it will seem more fit. But back then, people were just like, that's not George. I knew George. That's not George. The idea of, sort of a realistic portrait and an idealized torso is a bit of a mistake. You really have to go kind of all or nothing if you're going to idealize. I can actually point to another work that does exactly this. This is a statue of Napoleon Bonaparte, done by the great Antonio Canova. The statue is called Napoleon as Mars the Peacemaker, right? And this was commissioned by Napoleon himself from Canova. And this is what Canova came up with, and it's generally regarded as Canova's worst or maybe least successful statue. But here's the thing. Canova did it on purpose. Canova hated Napoleon. Because Canova wasn't just Italian, he was Venetian. He was from the most serene Republic of Venice, a republic which stood for 1,000 years until Napoleon showed up. And Canova never forgave Napoleon for dismantling his homeland. To the point where when Napoleon ordered Canova to come to Paris to work for him, Canova said no, pretty bluntly, and continued to say no until eventually Napoleon had to threaten the government in Rome with economic sanctions unless they made Canova go to Paris, which eventually happened. But
Was Napoleon Italian?
well, no, he was Corsican.
What?
He was Corsican. Get your own lecture. So this is what he made, and this is the kind of thing that if you're a master at your craft, you can produce a work that you know will be calculated to be risible, to be laughable, but no one can actually point to a particular part of that sculpture and say that's you made this bad on purpose. It's well sculpted, and it's exactly what Canova or what Napoleon ordered. He wanted a statue of himself as Mars, and so recognizable portrait on an idealized torso. Although frankly, it's not that ideal, is it? It's kind of flabby as far as Greek gods go. So it was unveiled with great fanfare, and Napoleon was there. And after about 10 minutes of people sort of snickering in the office, or in the audience, it was reveiled and never put on display. And where you see it now is in Apsley House in London, which was the home of the Duke of Wellington, who of course defeated Napoleon at Waterloo. I don't know if the English government bought the statue from the restored monarchy or if it was a gift, but then the English government gifted it to Napoleon. And so this is still sitting in his front hall. So the difference between the two, even though you can sort of say each statue is equally bad, one is intentional. One is intentional. And so, yes, people laughed at this, and it never actually made it into the Capitol Rotunda. It sort of sat outside on the front steps for a while, and it got moved further and further away from the Capitol, and eventually it ended up in the basement of the Smithsonian, where it is today. Horatio Ratio, the sculptor, died just a few years after this was completed. This is really pretty much his only widely known work. The kind of work that even if you don't study art, you might recognize. His portrait busts, some he did were quite excellent, but this is really his big thing. So, not to denigrate Horatio Ratio too much, though. I mean, it's probable that any neoclassical sculpture shown in the United States would have more or less failed in the eyes of the American public. Right? We've got to remember that a portrait bust with a little bit of toga around the neck, in the mansion of a wealthy Bostonian, that's one thing. But to put a statue in the middle of a town square was something fairly unprecedented in the United States. So there was no basis of comparison. you could, even if it was a beautiful statue, there's nothing to compare it to. And the shock of, sort of bare-chestedness, even though, we'd be hard-pressed to really call it nudity, was something that was just not in the cultural language, the visual symbolic language of the people of the United States. And it would have been seen, no matter how well it was done, it would have always been seen as a bit scandalous and a bit ridiculous. So let's go back to Hiram Powers, the other American, see how he did. Hiram Powers, the clockwork wax dummy guy, he turned his attention when he was influenced to several subjects. He did busts, just like Horatio Ratio did, but he was really interested in the human figure, especially the female human figure, and he made sort of copy after copy of different neoclassical female types, including this one. This is Eve, yes, Eve Tempted. She's got the apple right there. And Proserpina and Ginevra, and also nudes. And this would have been something, of course, that he would only have been exposed to in Europe. But his first major attempt at an ideal nude is this one, and not bad for your first, not necessarily his first try, his first major, life-size statue. You see Eve, holding an apple in her hand, and a serpent, actually. There's a snake coiling around the third leg. I don't know if you know this, but marble statuary pretty much requires, if it's a nude figure where it's just sort of, two ankles supporting the weight of the rest of the statue, you need an extra support, known as a third leg. So it could be a piece of drapery or a tree trunk. Michelangelo's David has a tree trunk, for example. And so on that third leg, you see the snake, curling around. It's a very simple idea of Eve, but it's done exceedingly well. It's done very, very, very well. And of course, there's no idealizing toga or other drapery in this work to detract from the lovely naturalism of the figure. So he's definitely using his eyes, working from life, and is a master of it in a way that Horatio Ratio never got to. Now his nudes were widely admired in Florence and beyond, but they were only admired in Florence and beyond by people who passed through the studio, because that's where his nudes were. It was very, very difficult. You couldn't find a buyer for most of his work. Certainly not from the American clientele. They're not going to commission a life-size nude statue, marble, and ship it back to Cincinnati. It's just not going to happen. So it was difficult to find a buyer. But in 1843, after Hiram Powers had been living in Florence for more than 5 years, he was reacquainted with an old friend who had come through Florence and decided to stay as well, Fanny Tall, who is now a very successful, very famous writer, the same woman who gave Powers the idea of the Dante's Inferno. And Fanny was a little bit dismayed at the fate of Hiram Powers. Here, this amazing sculptor with amazing work, but no market in the United States. And so they put their heads together, and once again, Fanny Tall came to the rescue and said, I think I have an idea of what we could do. Now, I mentioned that Fanny Tall had written the first abolitionist novel, Scenes from the Mississippi. And it is not recorded anywhere explicitly that Fanny said, hey, Hiram, you should do a statue about slavery. But when you look at the timeline, it seems quite a coincidence that she shows up, and then Hiram produces the work that he does. And in 1843, Hiram Powers addresses the issue of slavery in a sculpture called The Greek Slave. Now, this was the work that would skyrocket, would not only skyrocket Hiram Powers to international fame, but it would also be the sculpture that would sort of drag the prudish mindset of the general American public into acceptance of the new figure in art. This is one of the most important sculptures in American history. It was not, and of course it was an incredibly strong anti-slavery symbol as well, or symbol for the anti-slavery movement, with a fame on the par of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Right? This was made 20 years before the Civil War. So what do we see here? We see a late neoclassical style female nude in a pose very similar to the Medici Venus, which was sort of almost an archetype in Florence, an ancient Roman statue of a female nude of Venus. and that had been copied and emulated countless times by countless artists before. But here we see it yet again. She's standing in just a simple sort of contrapposto, weight on one leg, one hand placed on the draped post. You know, she's got to have that third leg. The only conceit towards indicating that she's a slave, of course, is the fact that her wrists are shackled to the post. Right? She's basically a Venus in chains. And if we don't know the context, we would think that the title Greek slave is merely just a justification for displaying what is ostensibly just an antique, Venus, an antique-inspired nude with a bit of a twist. Oh, she's got chains on. Oh, nice. But in fact, the work directly referenced not the ancient Greeks, but contemporary Greece and contemporary conflict, actual historical conflict that took place in the 1820s that resolved itself just only 10 years before this statue was made. The nation of Greece had won its independence from Turkey, right? From the Ottoman Empire, I should say, in 1832. And the Greek fight for independence aroused the intense interest of people all over Europe and the United States. And the conflict was really seen as representative of many things. For the United States, of course, it was representative of democracy, right? The United States had modeled itself on ancient Greek democracy, right? And they saw Greece, at least in the historical sense, as a kindred spirit, right? Many people who believe passionately in the ideals of independence and freedom and democracy actually went to Greece and fought on the side of the Greeks, including people like Lord Byron, most notably, right? And so the conflict really became the inspiration for many works of art and literature throughout the early 19th century. But beyond ideals of freedom and democracy, there was also the notion that Greece belonged to us, right? To Western European culture. And that Greece should not be ruled by them, the heathen Ottoman Turks. Right? So they were, the Ottoman Empire was a truly foreign nation to many in the West. And it's precisely this chord that Hiram Powers strikes with his Greek slave. See, in the context of the Greek War of Independence, we can see the Greek slave is not merely an allusion to the antique, but a contemporary Greek woman. Right? She's not an ancient Greek woman. She's a contemporary Greek woman, fallen into the clutches of the heathen enemy. Right? To reinforce the idea that this woman is one of us, she's got two things on her little draped post. I don't know if you can see it too clearly, but there's a little locket right here. And then down here, we have a little cross. So, cross symbolizing, obviously, that she is a Christian. And the locket would be ostensibly a symbol of the people back home who loved and cared for her. She was a treasured object. She was someone who would be missed. She's not just a nameless slave, a nameless victim of war taken into custody. She was somebody important, and she was somebody Christian. All right? So these were very, very intentionally added into the work to arouse a feeling of empathy and sympathy and identification with the American public. Right? The slave, well, actually, let me go ahead and read this. This is a quote from Hiram Powers himself describing this statue. The slave has been taken from one of the Greek islands by the Turks in the time of the Greek Revolution, the history of which is familiar to all. Her father and mother, and perhaps all her kindred, have been destroyed by her foes, and she alone preserved as a treasure too valuable to be thrown away. She is now among barbarian strangers, under the pressure of full recollection of the calamitous events which have brought her to her present state. And she stands exposed to the gaze of the people she abhors, and awaits her fate with intense anxiety, tempered indeed by the support of her reliance upon the goodness of God. Yeah, right? Strong stuff. And now, maybe, we can start to understand why this work would have been so popular in the 19th century in the United States. Because it uses the neoclassical idiom to express contemporary ideas and ideals. Think of Horatio Ratio's seated Zeus Washington, right? It's just big and highfalutin and grandiose, and it doesn't really appeal to us, right? But here we have a sculptor using the neoclassical idiom, which is one just neoclassicism and idealization of the body in a neoclassical way is one of the more impenetrable sort of modes of figuring in the history of Western figurative art. It can be very, very off-putting. It's intentionally elitist. You have to be educated in classics to really have appreciation for it. But here, we don't. We can just see this woman for what she is. She's, a figure with an actual identity. She's a Greek woman taken by the Turks, and I read about that in the papers just a few years ago. And she's a Christian, like me, and she had a mother and father, like me, right? So that empathy and identification was absolutely present to everyone who saw this one. What else do I want to say about this? Okay, we'll get to that in a second. So, this statue, as I mentioned, became one of the more famous statues in the United States in the 19th century. Numerous copies were made. I think something like 6 or 7 full life-size marbles were commissioned. The original marble actually toured the United States by train, stopping in cities all over the United States. Arousing huge fanfare. There'd be exhibitions. It was really kind of like the first blockbuster traveling art exhibit, which we're probably all too familiar with these days. But this was kind of the first thing, certainly in the United States. It was exhibited in London and in England, all over the place several times. It made several tours across the United States, or across the Atlantic Ocean from the United States. Writers, commentators would write about it. Poems were written about it. Nathaniel Hawthorne, Maria Lowell, Elizabeth Barrett Browning wrote poetry about this statue and inspired by this statue. But the real heart and soul of this statue, of course, is as a work of abolitionist propaganda, right? Because in America, for Americans, the work had an added significance. It wasn't just, poor Christian in the hands of the heathens. The abolitionist movement was growing stronger and stronger in the 1840s, coupled only by the growing strength of the pro-slavery sentiment. But the Greek slave was perfect propaganda for the abolitionists, because in the Greek slave, we, us, free white Americans, could empathize with one of our own in captivity, right? Much more, perhaps, than free white Americans in the 19th century would empathize with the statue of an African-American slave, one of them, right? So this was a way to make a statue palatable enough to the 19th century public, which, by our standards, of course, would be just, the most, racist society, far more racist than the society in which we suffer today. But it sort of removes it by one step by not making it about African slavery, but by making it about Greek slavery, right? So it effectively brought both the horror and the hypocrisy of slavery home to America. And this was the reason it was the biggest sensation in the 19th century. The anti-slavery sentiment in the Greek slave is just one way, of course, in which this sculpture caused a commotion. Of course, it's also new, isn't it? Right? The other commotion is caused by its nudity. When it was exhibited, it was very common practice, and even actually before. When you go to the Pennsylvania Academy or the Boston Athenaeum to look at Canova's casts, you would have separate viewing times for men and for women. The men would go in, come out, women would go in, come out. So they wouldn't have to be in the same room looking at a new statue, right? And it sounds incredibly prudish, but one has to remember, again, that there was really no context in American society in which men and women who didn't know each other got together in front of a representation of a naked body. That just did not happen. And so it wasn't prudery so much, it was just an avoidance of an awkward and unprecedented situation. Separation of the sexes was just really just to avoid, social embarrassment. Now the classical and neoclassical ideals which these sorts of nudes strove for, were largely lost on the American. When you see this work, and if you're a 19th century American, you pretty much, except for the fact that it was about slavery and really, connected to its audience about the hypocrisy of slavery. The next thing you noticed was the fact that it was naked, naked, naked. It was always in the forefront of people's minds when we saw this, and they had trouble getting over the materiality of the nude. And so inevitably, when many Americans came to Europe and saw things like the Venus de Medici, which we see over there, right here, which is the original, I guess, from which the Greek slave was made. When Americans would see this, they would see this as work that is primarily lascivious, right? It's just flesh for the sake of exposing flesh, right? But with the Greek slave, it changed all that. Because in terms of motive, the Greek slave is practically the opposite of the Venus, right? The Greek slave is not an unashamed, nude pagan goddess of love. She's a faithful Christian, and she's unclothed not by choice, right? She's stripped of her garments against her will by her heathen enemies, right? Her nudity then, for the audience of the 19th century, becomes not a subject of scorn or lust, but one of pity. And that was a big thing for the United States, to realize that art could move you to another notion besides lust. And this is the first time they ever saw an example of that. I can't go on enough about this statue. It's really, really important. And so anyway, when the statue finally arrived in the United States in the 1840s and toured around all over the place, it was put on a revolving pedestal because you can see in this diagram here, a red velvet curtain was put around it so that people could be in the room with it. That's actually, look at it. And so in order to see the back, you could turn it. So you could go up and you could actually, turn the handle and, rotate the sculpture to be able to see it. But, at a certain point, the red velvet curtain went away because it just didn't matter. Because everyone came to see it. That was the reason you would go to these exhibitions, was to see the Greek slave. So, two American sculptors with very different backgrounds, Horatio Ratio, Hiram Powers, two very different careers. But of course, they were just two of the dozens and dozens of sculptors and painters who journeyed from the United States to the craft in Italy, and that is a tradition that, of course, continues to this day, and that I have a kind of a personal connection to. As you know, I studied in Italy, I studied in Italy. Let me show you something here. So, this is this is a photograph taken just a few years, maybe just a year after the death of Lorenzo Bartolini, who Horatio Ratio studied with and actually lived in his studio. So it's taken probably in 1853, 54. And when Lorenzo Bartolini died, he left in his will basically everything you see here, including the studio itself, to his right-hand man, Pasquale Romanelli. Pasquale Romanelli finished the unfinished sculptures that Bartolini had left behind by his death, and then had his own career. And then Pasquale Romanelli's son, Raffaello Romanelli, had a career as well, as did Raffaello's son, Romano Romanelli. So three generations of Romanelli sculptors working in Lorenzo Bartolini's studio. And it's still going. It's still a sculpture studio. It's been a sculpture studio for 2 centuries now. It is still owned by the Romanelli family. I can show you a couple things here. So this is the same room, and this is the second of the 3 generations. This is Raffaello Romanelli, probably taken in the 1890s. Same room, you can't really see, but different sculpture. And there we have the original photo, and there is an image of the same room, almost from the same point of view as it exists today. You can see the columns and the arches there, and the room that goes back. That's still there. It's all still there. And you know what else is there? In the upper floor of this building, there is a small art school known as Charles Cecil Studio. And it is where I studied and taught for a decade. And it's also where Kevin studied. That's where Kevin and I met. In the building, in the room directly above this. And in fact, just outside of the frame of this picture was the room that I used as my sculpture studio for over a decade. Here we have the facade, such as it is. It's an old church. You can barely tell that it's a church, but it was built in the 13th century. And there's Charles Cecil himself, an American painter, who very kindly took me in the fall of 1996 to work in this room, the sculpture department here. Right? This is as it exists now. Now, when I started studying there were no Romanelli sculptors anymore. So after those 3 generations of Romanelli sculptors, the next 2 generations focused on business, importing and exporting, and selling copies of sculpture, but not producing original works of art themselves. I started teaching there in sort of a little experimental sculpture department. Charles Cecil was a painter, but he wanted to offer sculpture as well, and so I, through some twists and turns, became the head of that little department. And eventually, do I have a picture of him? I don't, do I? I thought I did. And eventually, the current generation of the Romanelli family, a man by the name again, Raphael Romanelli, became one of my students. And so that's my little sort of, that's where I dipped my toe in the waters of art history. Not by studying it in books, but actually by living it. I was in the studio for a couple of years before I knew who Horatio Ratio was. The first American sculptor to come to Italy, to come to Europe to study sculpture. He did so in the same 4 walls that I did. And that has been a source of inspiration and motivation for me to become an art historian, which I am today, as well as a sculptor. What more can I say? It's an amazing time, an amazing place. I mentioned this at the beginning of the lecture, that art history is a continuum and we are the current chapter of it. And rarely do I feel that more strongly than in Florence. So, thank you very much. Any questions about anything about Reno or Powers or Kevin?
That chain on that sculpture, that's still in the wall, that chain?
Yeah. Yes.
Why don't you use a Hieronymus Bosch painting?
I'm sorry?
Why don't you use a Hieronymus Bosch painting for Dante's Inferno?
Where were you when I was putting this lecture? Anyone else with a smart comment?
Available for weddings and mornings?
Yes, exactly. Available for portrait commissions. Sure.
They love it there.
Yeah, still there for 23 years. Never left. Yeah. As I mentioned, I'm on tour right now. My home is Florence. A beautiful studio, a big Renaissance palace, right on the river. I'm sorry? Absolutely, all standing invitation. I'm 100% serious. If you're coming to Florence, you gotta look me up. Huh?
When are you coming back?
September.
Question.
Yes.
I was fascinated by the fact that so much of the marble sculpting is somewhat outsourced to artisans. When did that practice actually start in Italy?
Probably around in Italy. I was going to say in Greece about 5th century BC. You don't build the Parthenon with one guy. Although one guy, we assume, designed Phidias designed the sculptural scheme, but he had hundreds of sculptors carving his designs, which he would model in clay, and then they would do copies of. And really, actually, the sort of antique marbles that survive are copies of original bronze works. So 4th century BC in Greece, in Athens, that's when bronze statuary came into its own for the first time. Life-size bronze works produced. People like Myron and Phidias worked primarily in bronze. And, maybe not so much Phidias, but Myron and Praxiteles and Lysippus would work in bronze, and then their works would be copied into marble. And so the skill to copy very, very faithfully from a model into marble is a very old technique. And this is how we get, Greek work littering Rome, because when the Romans conquered Greece and subsumed it into the empire, they're like, ooh, that looked good in my villa, and so they get someone to make a copy. No, it's always been a part of it, and we have this myth of, you know, Michelangelo throwing away his model, you know, solitary work, doing all the work himself, you know, and you know, not using models at all, just sort of freeing the figures inside. That's 100% bunk. Not true at all. At one point in his life, Michelangelo had a crew of 50 workers. He had a mid-sized construction company when he was in his middle age doing the Medici Chapel. In the Medici Chapel, you can see several sculptures, all designed by Michelangelo, but only some of them carved, and two, very obviously not finished by Michelangelo, but carved from his designs. Well, what would his design be? It would be a model that he would make and play, and give someone else to carve. So it's a very old, very respectable way to do it. Yeah.
You ever heard of the Picciolini brothers?
Yes, I have heard of the Picciolini brothers.
They carved the statue of Lincoln.
Yeah, they carved the Lincoln, they carved, so the Picciolini brothers. Yeah,
How come nobody ever heard of it?
I just told you I did.
But you know about it, but then
So do you.
nobody else does.
Oh, wait, nobody else does. Yeah, no, lots of people. Okay, so the Picciolini brothers, they were from the town of Massa, Carrara, which is right next to Carrara. Atelier Picciolini and his 6 sons moved to New York in the middle of the 19th century and opened up a marble carving studio there. Atelier and one of the sons were artists in their own right, maybe a couple of the sons, but mostly they served the sculptors who were coming back from Italy and then eventually Paris as well. People like Augustus St. Gaudens, Daniel Chester French, you know, of course French did the Lincoln Memorial, would employ the Picciolini brothers. Basically, you know, the stuff in front of the customs house, you know, down below Wall Street. Basically, any sort of Beaux-Arts architectural sculpture that you see in Manhattan of any sort of size and of marble, probably by the Picciolini brothers.
They said that all of Bishop Chester Francis,
Daniel.
all of his sculptures were done by Picciolini.
Not true.
All the stone carvings.
Not true.
Yeah.
If you go to Chesterwood, which is his studio, you can see Daniel Chester French's last work. Is it called Dawn or something like that? It's a beautiful, beautiful nude that he worked on himself in his later years. Yeah, you know, he knew about carving. And someone else had a question. Yes, Phil.
Does Michelangelo still get credit for carving the David?
Yeah, but he had help. It wasn't just him. It wasn't just him.
But it wasn't farmed out.
Well, no, it wasn't. No, they're not. It's never farmed out. It's always under the supervision of the sculptors. But yeah, Michelangelo, the myths that survive about Michelangelo, many of them come from Michelangelo himself. He absolutely took control of his legacy. He was not happy with Giorgio Vasari's biography, even though Giorgio Vasari called him the greatest artist that ever lived. That wasn't good enough for Michelangelo, so he commissioned basically a ghostwriter, a guy named Astano Conditi, to write a second biography just a year or two later, in which we hear all sorts of wonderful things about Michelangelo, how he's born from an ancient noble house, and that no one actually had to teach him how to carve. He just knew because his wet nurse was a stone carver's wife, and so he literally drank it in for the milk. He said this, right? And so it's amazing what he tells us, and also what he doesn't tell us, because he purposefully avoids mentioning his teachers. We don't know who taught Michelangelo how to carve marble. Isn't that incredible? Yeah. We know so much about Michelangelo. That's something we don't know, and that was on purpose hidden from us by Michelangelo, because he's a genius, right? It's all finished.
When you carve like sculptures,
Yeah.
You got other people chipping away with things that don't matter.
No, me, because for 2 reasons. One, I'm a sculptor because I actually really like to carve.
Yeah.
I was a stonemason before ever learning anything about art. I enjoy the work. I have had to resort in one instance to using robotic technology actually to sort of CNC away the major chunks, basically doing in 3 days what would have taken me 2 months to do. And then I finished it all myself by hand. And the reason I could do that was just a time constraint. It was going on the facade of a church, and the church was built, and it needed to be done. So, and there's no shame in it. I mean, if it's good enough for Michelangelo, and Bernini, and Canova, and every sculptor you've ever heard of.
Can you explain what pointing is?
Boy, this guy.
say, I want to make this
Mhm.
19 feet tall.
Yeah, they can do it.
I know, they can do it, but
Yeah.
how do they do that?
You know, I have to teach a workshop 2 weeks long to get people to understand how to do it. But it works. But I gotta move to someone else. Phil, you had your hand up. Hang on. Phil, you had your hand up for like 10 minutes.
No, it was a fascinating talk.
Oh, thank you.
I think you mentioned that Hiram Powers was the first American sculptor
Horatio Ratio.
recognized in Europe as an important sculptor. What was that process? Was the evolution of American sculpture recognized, and when was it recognized as something important or unique in Europe?
American sculpture or an American sculptor? Those are two very different things. Well, I don't know if American sculpture has ever been recognized as something important in Europe. But it certainly wouldn't have been back with Hiram Powers. Hiram Powers was a sculptor who made a singular work that gained international fame throughout Europe. But I don't think people saw that and said, well, America has arrived. I don't know if that really ever happened in the Western tradition, simply because we came to it so late in the game. By the time we got any good at all, things had already shifted to Paris, and then all the sculptors had to scurry off to Paris to get that training, and it really was only about a generation and a half. People like St. Gaudens and Daniel Chester French, who else? Others, William Wetmore's story, that, no, not even him, really. You know, they became known as well. Even Gutzon Borglum and his brother Solon Borglum became popular, but I don't think anyone in Europe, and I could be wrong, detected a national movement in figurative sculpture before it all sort of went south after World War I. I don't know if that's really. I mean, nowadays, of course, with the benefit of hindsight, we can look back and we can see all the wonderful sculptures that people did in the 19th century using, sort of indigenous or Native American themes and motifs and characters. Some of it not even racist, and see that as something that is intrinsically American. But I don't think it was recognized too much. Yeah.
Well, I had an answer to this question. I was trying to.
Did you Google it? I can give you the answer. My phone says pointing.
How they miniaturize. They start with the full size, and then they have a gear with feelers on it, and each time they change the gear, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller.
I've never heard of compasses. I actually, if you want to stay for another hour, it's basically triangulation. To locate any point on the surface of a cast, you need to locate it relative to 3 other known points set in, exact relations. Canova actually perfected a machine that was invented about 50 years before Canova, called the macchinetta a punto, the pointing machine, which simplified the process, but the process itself of using compasses to triangulate on a 3-dimensional surface goes, again, they were using it for the Parthenon, all the way back. And if your culture has the ability to navigate by the stars or survey land or any sort of topographical triangulation, then they have the geometrical know-how to point it out. It's actually very simple, and it's likely that
And they prefer to have regular tables.
but it's simple when you do it. Impossible to explain without pictures. But come to my studio in Florence, you can see me do it.
We're interested.
There's my studio. If you go down this street, you asked me where my studio was. You go down this street, my studio is about here. I'm right on the river. This is Lugano Codigiani. There's the Ponte Vecchio. There's the Uffizi. I'm literally. Oh wait a minute. No. Okay, I'm literally right there. That yellow, the smaller, little building. It says Jason Arkles Sculptor. Yeah, but I mean, lots of pointers. I'm there. It's a pretty great studio.
Thank you so much.
water placement, August 12th through the
Whole week, starting August 12th.
whole week starting August 12th. I'm very excited for that. There still are spots open. I'm one of the students